23andMe fucked it up for everybody. I mean that literally. If you've ever hesitated to get a DNA test because you didn't trust where your data went afterwards, well, you weren't being paranoid. You, my friend, were paying attention. And this video is gonna explain exactly what happened, why it happened, and what we built so you can stop guessing. I wanna be clear about something before I get into this video here. This is not a pile-on video on 23andMe, okay? They went bankrupt in 2025 and for the most part, it's over. But the damage that these assholes did to this industry is not over, because on a daily basis, I get asked, well, if I do the DNA test with you, Mason, what actually happens to my data? And that is a result of 23andMe. So, let's actually answer it. To understand what happened, you actually have to understand what 23andMe was as a company, not what the marketing said, okay? Because the spit tube and where your grandparents came from, well, that was never really the product. That was the door that you walk through. Your genetic data, your whole raw genome, that was the product, stored indefinitely. Here's the business model they built. You come in through the door, you buy a $99 or $199 genetic test kit. What happens is they store your raw data, and then they sell your raw data to pharmaceutical partnerships like GlaxoSmithKline, who in 2018 paid $300 million for your data. Think about what that number means for a second. 15 million users times your genetic data equals a product worth far, far, far more than the measly number that you actually paid for the kit. You were the product and the customer at the same time. And I want to be precise here because the nuance matters. This is not inherently criminal. Pharmaceutical research has real value. What matters though is what they told the customers they were doing versus what they were actually doing. Because most people who signed up to take this DNA test were just there to figure out where grandma came from. They didn't think they were adding their genome to a commercial database that would be licensed to drug companies. The consent was technically there in the terms of service, buried, which is basically another way of saying there really wasn't much consent. And if that already sounded bad enough, well, just you wait. In October 2023, 23andMe disclosed that they had a data breach. It was a credential-stuffing breach where someone basically took credentials from other breached websites and tried it on 23andMe. And guess what? It worked. After doing such, they had access to basically all of 23andMe's data. All right, including yours. That was a breach of nearly 14 million users and their genetic data. To make matters even worse, the company's first public response to this was to actually imply that it was the user's fault for reusing their passwords. I'll let you sit with that for a second. Think about that. Your genetic data is now in someone else's hands, and the company's first response is to go after you because of your password hygiene. Make that make sense. Anyways, this told you everything that you needed to know about 23andMe as a company and what they thought about you. They didn't care about your genetic data getting exposed. They were just worried about the fact that you were a cog in their liability math. Then, in early 2025, 23andMe filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And this is where the real problem started. Not from the genetic breach, not from selling your data to pharmaceutical research. When a company files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, well, all of their assets go up for sale. Real estate, patents, equipment, and in this case, the genetic data for 15 million users. This got so bad that the Attorney General for California came out with a public warning to everybody who had ever bought a DNA test kit from 23andMe. His warning: delete your data and request deletion of your account before the bankruptcy solidifies. Think about that for a second. The top official in one of the most populated states in America came out with a warning for a bankruptcy. That is not a normal bankruptcy. That is a person who felt responsible for your protection had to say something because this matter was so sensitive. And here's what that means in plain English. Well, the company that you bought your test kit from doesn't exist anymore. And the company that bought the data doesn't have to abide by any of the policies that were set up, including their privacy policy. So the assets that they gained, your genetic data, falls into the hands of whoever the highest bidder is. And we don't know who that is. It could be a private equity firm. It could be a foreign entity. It could be somebody with a lot of fucking money. Who knows? The point is that all of your data is gone to them. The founder of 23andMe, Anne Wojcicki, actually tried to buy the company back herself because she inherently knew that she did not want that database ending up in the wrong hands. You know, it's pretty bad when the former founder of the company tries desperately to buy her own company back because she knows the implications of that database ending up in the wrong hands. And this is what I mean when I say that 23andMe fucked it up for everybody, not just their customers, because now anybody who owns a DNA testing company has to walk into that room. And anybody with a brain asks the very first question of, well, where does my data go? And what happens if your company blows up? That is not paranoia. That is a very, very smart question that the market learned to ask because 23andMe taught us that we should be a lot more careful with our data. And most companies in that space can't actually answer those questions cleanly because they have built a business model around the same genetic data. One who can sell it to pharmaceutical companies for $300 million. The distrust is not irrational. It's totally rational because people who are actually interested in their genetic data and the benefits that it can provide deserve an actual answer to that question, not just some generic privacy policy paragraph. Now, I want to say something before I tell you what we actually built here, because we were building when all of this was going on. California Attorney General warning, the bankruptcy, the privacy breach, etc. And the one thing that I did not want for my company is to be another 23andMe. So we had to make decisions about what we store and what we collect so that we would not end up in the same boat as all of these other consumer genomics companies. So here's what we actually built. Not what the website says, what the actual architecture behind what we're testing here is actually made up of, because that is extremely important to you. And if I'm going to ask you to trust us as a genetics company, I might show you exactly what we're doing behind the scenes. A project rebuilt, here's what we do. We run 35 genes. That's it. Not your whole entire ancestry composition, not every single predisposition that could possibly ever be relevant to anything. 35 very specific genes, because those genes connect to a very specific protocol output. If the gene did not influence a very specific and critical protocol output, it didn't make it into the panel, because we did not want to end up in the same boat that the folks at 23andMe did. These 35 genes cover some very specific pillars here in the genetics world: methylation and B vitamin metabolism, oxidative stress, immune health and inflammatory response, hormone metabolism and detoxification, oxidative stress, and neurotransmitter balance. Every single one of those categories requires a specific protocol output. Every nutritional adjustment, every environmental recommendation, if it doesn't connect to something in those categories, well, it's not in the system. The important part here is that we do not collect raw genome sequencing. It's 35 genes, that's it. Your kit ships to our lab partner. What comes back is a personalized report for you. That report feeds into our protocol builder. There's no database, storage, etc. that has your name on it with a whole raw genome sequence. That's it. That is something that 23andMe had never built. Now let me be specific about what the data actually shows, because "We protect your privacy" is something that every company says in their privacy policy. When your kit comes back from the lab, what it shows is not your name connected to a whole genome sequence. What comes back are your genetic variants, the SNPs, RS numbers, and a simple green, yellow, and red system that you can actually follow. Here is a very real example of how our protocol builder interprets that genetic data. If your comp is running slow, homozygous slow, which would be red on your report, well, that warrants a very specific response. And if either of your MTHFR genes are red, homozygous, well, you'll be recommended folinic acid instead of methylfolate, because the combination of those two genes creates a very serious methylation pressure risk that requires a specific response. Has nothing to do with your name, has nothing to do with your file. It's two variants that require a very specific output. When my lab partner and I look at aggregate data over time, the only question that data is answering is, does this gene combination consistently point towards one approach over another? What the variant does, not who has it. That distinction is the entire difference between how we built this and how 23andMe built theirs. The reason 23andMe could get breached, sell your genetic data to pharmaceutical companies, and put your whole genome on a bankruptcy auction sheet is because they never made the design decision of what they would and wouldn't collect. The database was the business. So the database grew with no floor on it. And you clearly see where that landed. Their own founder tried to buy the company back because she knew the implications of that potentially getting into the wrong hands. We made that decision before the first kit even shipped. 35 genes, no raw sequence, no whole genome file, finite by design. Not because it was easy to build, because we didn't want to end up in the same boat as all of these other consumer genetic companies. If you've been holding off on getting your genetics tested because of what 23andMe did, that hesitation is completely warranted. And what 23andMe proved is not that genetics is dangerous. It proved that when you build a bad business model around the science, well, that is certainly dangerous. The science is real. What your genetics say about your inflammation, hormone metabolism, and neurotransmitter balance is very real. 23andMe didn't break the science. They just didn't build around it. We built around the science and skipped everything else. If you made it this far and you want to actually understand how our 35 gene system works without diving into the deep end, well, the rebuilt field manual is available on Amazon for purchase for $34.99. That's where this starts, and it covers the whole entire system if you want to read before you run. Catch you in the next one.